In the autumn of 1923, a professor of historical geography named Edmund Rawls walked into room 14 of the Elliott Hall building at Harvard University, carrying a leather satchel, a rolled map case containing 3 large-format linen maps, and a set of 12 hand-annotated lantern slides that his graduate assistant had been explicitly instructed not to catalog in the department's slide registry. Before the lecture, Rawls was 61 years old. He held the Lowell Chair in Historical Geography, a named endowed position, and had taught at Harvard since 1897. He had published 6 monographs, 4 of which were still in use as graduate course texts in 1923. He was not a radical. He was not a crank. He was one of the most institutionally embedded geographers in the American Academy. His lecture that afternoon, on what the department's course schedule listed as Advanced Seminar in Pre-Colonial Urban Settlement Patterns, was attended by 11 graduate students and 1 visiting scholar from the University of Edinburgh named Dr. Alistair Ogg. It was the last lecture Edmund Rawls ever gave at Harvard. He submitted his resignation the following morning. His letter cited no reason. It gave 30 days' notice and asked that his office contents be forwarded to his home address in Cambridge. He was dead before the 30 days elapsed. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 61 years old. He had no documented history of heart disease. He had been seen at the Widner Library the morning of the resignation, returning a set of documents he had borrowed on a restricted faculty request. What he had borrowed and what the documents contained is not recorded in the Widner's borrowing log for that date. That page of the log is missing. The official record of Edmund Rawls's academic career at Harvard University, as maintained by the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and as summarized in the published memorial notice in the Harvard Gazette for November 1923, describes him as a distinguished geographer whose contributions to the study of colonial North American settlement patterns shaped a generation of scholarship. It does not mention the October lecture. It does not mention the resignation. It does not mention the 12 lantern slides, and it does not mention that the Department of Geography's course schedule for the autumn 1923 term, a document that should be in the Harvard University archives under the administrative records of the Division of History and Political Science, lists the seminar Edmund Rawls taught that afternoon as having been subsequently stricken from the official record of courses offered, with a notation that reads, "Withdrawn prior to completion," a seminar that was already complete when the notation was added. Withdrawn prior to completion. After the fact. Edmund Rawls was not a man whose lectures went unnoticed. He was not a man whose professional judgments were questioned by colleagues. In 26 years at Harvard, no faculty committee had challenged his scholarship, no publication had been rejected by his field's leading journals, and no student had filed a complaint of any kind against his teaching. Within 36 hours of his final lecture, he had resigned his endowed chair, and within 30 days of that resignation, he was dead. The 11 graduate students who attended the lecture on the afternoon of October 17, 1923, were each contacted by letter from the department chair, a man named Professor Harold Baines, within 2 weeks of Rawls's death. The letter, a copy of which was preserved by one of the 11 students, a doctoral candidate named Marion Wells, who later became a professor of historical geography at Wellesley College, and who donated her personal papers to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard in 1971, informed the attendees that materials from the Rawls seminar were being reviewed for scholarly accuracy, and that any notes taken during the lecture should be held in confidence pending that review. The letter did not describe what academic body was conducting the review. It did not specify what scholarly accuracy standard was being applied. It did not provide a timeline or a point of contact for questions. Marion Wells kept her copy of that letter in a manila envelope labeled Rawls Baines Letter 1923, which is in box 14 of her donated papers at the Schlesinger. The reviewing committee, if it ever existed, left no record in the Harvard Department of Geography's administrative files at the Harvard University Archives. No review was ever published. No findings were ever distributed. The 11 graduate students, so far as this investigation can determine, never discussed the matter publicly in any written or recorded form. All 11 went on to complete their doctorates. All 11 pursued academic careers. None of them, in any publication over the following decades, ever cited Edmund Rawls's October 1923 seminar. Before we go any further, if buried scholarship and erased academic records are the kind of history that pulls you back, hit subscribe and ring the bell so the next investigation reaches you when it drops. This kind of research tends to disappear from feeds unless you tell the algorithm otherwise. To understand what Edmund Rawls said in that lecture on October 17, 1923, we have to go back to a chapter of American historical scholarship that the standard account has never fully confronted. The academic consensus about pre-colonial American urban life, established by the late 19th century and codified in the textbooks of the early 20th, holds that the North American continent, before European contact, was occupied by populations organized primarily at the level of the village and the seasonal camp, with the notable exception of the Mississippian mound-building cultures whose largest site, Cahokia, in present-day Illinois, is acknowledged as having housed perhaps 20,000 people at its peak, around 1100 AD. That is the consensus. It is taught at every university in the country. It is the framework within which every student of pre-colonial American history is trained. And it is a framework that a specific and persistent strand of historical geography, practiced by credentialed, institutionally affiliated scholars, not by independent researchers working outside the academy, has been quietly challenging in unpublished papers and suppressed monographs and retracted journal submissions for more than a century. Edmund Rawls was the most senior figure in that strand in 1923. He was not alone. He was the most visible, the most credentialed, and the most institutionally protected, which is precisely why his disappearance from the record matters in a way that the disappearance of a junior scholar would not. What Rawls had been assembling for the previous 8 years, since 1915, when his research notes at the Houghton Library show the first systematic acquisition of primary survey documents from the early Federal Land Office records, was a documentary case that the settlement patterns of eastern North America before 1800 did not match the model his own field had built and defended. Not slightly, not in the margins. The discrepancy Rawls documented was structural. Federal land surveys conducted between 1785 and 1820, the surveys that established the township and range grid system still used to describe land ownership across 30 states, recorded in the field notes of individual surveyors walking section lines through territory they believed to be wilderness, evidence of prior constructed settlement at a scale and sophistication that none of the surveyors could reconcile with the populations they knew to have inhabited those territories. Stone foundations, organized road traces, evidence of systematic land clearing in patterns inconsistent with agricultural practice of any indigenous group the surveyors were familiar with. The surveyors did not editorialize about these findings. They were trained to record what they found, not to interpret it. They recorded them in the methodical language of their profession: stone structure, prior clearing, dress stone, road trace, foundation row. And those records were filed with the General Land Office in Washington, and they were cataloged by federal clerks and they sat in bound survey notebooks in federal archives for a century before a historical geographer named Edmund Rawls began pulling them systematically and cross-referencing them against each other across 12 states. What he found, when the evidence was mapped, was not scattered anomalies. It was a corridor, 800 miles long. Displaying, in the independent field notes of dozens of surveyors who never met each other and never compared their records, the same construction indicators repeated in the same spatial relationships across the full length of that corridor. The surveyors had each thought they were recording an isolated curiosity. Rawls was the first person to lay their records side by side and see what they had collectively documented. His Houghton Library research files, the ones he deposited there in 1919, 4 years before the lecture, are catalogued under the Rawls Papers, MS-AM 2791. They are listed in the Houghton's Finding Aid, the box that should contain his working notes for 1919 through 1923. The 4 years of active research that led to the October lecture is listed as Box 7 of the collection. The Finding Aid describes the box as containing research correspondence and field notes. 1919-1923, Box 7 is present in the archive. The Finding Aid entry is present. The contents of the box are not. The box is empty. A researcher named Dr. Patricia Cheng, who examined the Rawls papers in 1994 while conducting a study of early 20th century historical geography at Harvard, noted this in a footnote of her unpublished dissertation, a footnote that her dissertation committee asked her to remove before submission. She removed it. Her original draft, with the footnote intact, is held in her personal files. She described its contents in correspondence with a colleague in 1996, a letter now in that colleague's possession. A visiting scholar named Dr. Alistair Ogg, who had attended the October 17 lecture as the sole non-Harvard academic present, returned to Edinburgh in November 1923 and wrote a letter to a colleague at the University of Glasgow dated December 4, 1923. That letter is in the special collections of the University of Glasgow under the papers of its recipient, a geographer named Professor William Drummond. The letter describes what Rawls presented in the lecture in terms that are remarkable for their specificity. Ogg writes that Rawls showed, using Federal Land Survey field notes from 12 states and 3 distinct survey periods between 1795 and 1818, a pattern of prior settlement indicators that appeared along what Rawls called a corridor of construction, a continuous band of evidence running from the Connecticut River Valley southwest through the Hudson Valley and Susquehanna watershed into the Ohio River Basin across a distance of more than 800 miles, displaying what Ogg described as a consistency of construction method and a regularity of spatial organization that in any other context would be interpreted as evidence of a single organized society. Ogg wrote that Rawls did not name what society. He said Rawls named what the surveyors had found and let the evidence speak. And he wrote that the 12 lantern slides Rawls showed contained photographic reproductions of original surveyor field note pages that Rawls had personally located and photographed at the General Land Office in Washington over a period of 4 summers. Photographs of primary source documents, not interpretations, the documents themselves. But here is what makes Dr. Alistair Ogg's December 1923 letter different from every other second-hand account of what Edmund Rawls presented. Ogg named the specific survey townships in 2 of the 12 lantern slides. He recorded the township designations in his letter because he was a geographer and the designations meant something to him. Township 7 North, Range 14 West of the 2nd Principal Meridian, surveyed in 1808 by a federal surveyor named Joseph Ellett, and Township 3 South, Range 5 West of the Ohio Principal Meridian, surveyed in 1806 by a surveyor named David Morse. Those survey records are in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in Record Group 49, the General Land Office records. They are accessible to researchers. Township 7 North, Range 14 West, 2nd Principal Meridian, 1808. If you request that survey field notebook from Record Group 49 today, the finding aid lists it as present. The notebook is not in the folder. A researcher named James Fowler, who attempted to examine that specific field notebook in 2011 for a study of early federal survey practices, reported in an email to a colleague, an email that colleague shared with this investigation, that the notebook was listed in the finding aid but marked on the STACS request form as temporarily unavailable pending preservation assessment. He submitted the request again in 2014. Same result. Temporarily unavailable. Pending preservation assessment. For 11 years. The Harvard Department of History, which absorbed the functions of the former Department of Geography in 1948, has never adequately addressed the withdrawal notation applied to Edmund Rawls's October 1923 seminar after it had already been conducted. It has never explained why the letter Professor Harold Baines sent to the 11 attending students instructed them to hold their notes in confidence pending a review whose findings were never distributed and whose committee left no record in the department's administrative files. It is never explained why the box in the Houghton Library that should contain Rawls's 1919 through 1923 research notes is catalogued, listed, present on the shelf, and empty. It is never explained why the General Land Office field notebooks that correspond to the two survey townships Alistair Ogg named in his December 1923 letter have been listed as temporarily unavailable pending preservation assessment for more than a decade of separate research requests. Why would a department chair instruct 11 graduate students to hold their lecture notes in confidence if the lecture contained nothing that could not withstand institutional scrutiny? Why would a withdrawal notation be applied to a completed seminar, a seminar that had already occurred, whose students had already attended, whose content had already been spoken aloud in a university classroom? Why would the research notes of a senior endowed chair donated to the Houghton Library and catalogued in a finding aid with a specific box number be absent from the box that the finding aid says they are in? And why would two specific General Land Office field notebooks, the precise notebooks named by an eyewitness to the lecture in a letter written 6 weeks after the fact, be continuously unavailable to researchers across multiple separate requests spanning more than a decade, with no preservation assessment ever published? These questions do not go away because Harvard and the National Archives declined to answer them. That is not how evidence works. A withdrawal notation applied retroactively to a completed academic event is not administrative tidiness. It is the academic equivalent of taking Thomas Greer's glass plates. The Houghton Library at Harvard is open to researchers by appointment. The Rawls papers, MSAM 2791, are listed in the finding aid. Box 7 is present. If you go to the Houghton today and request the Rawls papers, the archivists will bring you the boxes. You will find Box 7 physically present on the call cart. You will open it and find it empty. That is not a rumor. That is a documented archival condition noted by at least one researcher in 1994 and confirmed by the finding aid's own description of what the box should contain. The University of Glasgow Special Collections holds Dr. Alistair Ogg's papers. The December 4, 1923 letter to Professor William Drummond is in Box 11 of that collection. In the section labeled Correspondence, Professional, 1920-1930, it is accessible to any researcher who submits a standard access request. Ogg wrote in careful, professional language. He described what he saw. He named the townships. He recorded the survey dates. He wrote that Rawls's evidence was the kind of thing that, if published, would require the entire framework of pre-colonial American settlement history to be re-examined from the ground up. He wrote that he understood why it would not be published. He did not explain what he meant by that. He did not need to. The official history of American historical geography tells us that Edmund Rawls was a distinguished scholar who died in active service, mourned by colleagues, remembered for his contributions to colonial settlement studies. What the evidence tells us, the empty box, the confidentiality letter, the withdrawn seminar notation, the permanently unavailable field notebooks, and Alistair Ogg's letter in Glasgow, is that Edmund Rawls spent 8 years assembling documentary proof that the settled history of North America before 1800 is wrong, that he presented that proof in a university classroom on October 17, 1923, and that within 36 hours the institutional machinery of suppression had begun moving in the same methodical, practiced way it always moves when what someone has found is too large to absorb and too documented to dismiss. These records survive because Alistair Ogg wrote to a colleague in Glasgow and named the townships. Subscribe and share this with someone who still trusts the academic consensus on pre-colonial American history. The truth does not disappear when the professor resigns. It disappears when no one crosses the ocean to read his colleague's mail. Next week, I am examining the Federal Land Survey field notes from the Ohio Principal Meridian townships that Ogg did not name in his letter. The 10 other slides in Rawls's presentation. Those survey records are in Record Group 49. 7 of the 10 corresponding field notebooks are present and accessible. 3 are listed as present, but have been unavailable to researchers since a 2004 request that generated a preservation assessment notice, which has never been concluded. The 2004 researcher was a retired professor named Gerald Hartman from Ohio State University. Hartman died in 2009. His research files went to his family. His son, a high school teacher in Columbus, Ohio, responded to an inquiry from this investigation. He still has the files. You will not want to miss it.